Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us today for this conversation on China and the Pacific Island states. My name is Darshana Baruah, and I'm a fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It is my absolute pleasure to be hosting today the first discussion of 2024 for Carnegie China's Global Dialogue Series. Carnegie China is the endowment's East Asia based office that looks at and focuses on understanding China's regional and global role. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by two phenomenal experts to have this conversation and discuss the issue that has caught a lot of attention between China and the evolving relationship between China and the Pacific Island states. Joining me on screen today is first Dr. Satyendra Prasad, who's currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Prasad, of course, has had a very celebrated diplomatic career, and he's also the former ambassador of Fiji to the United States, United Nations, and Canada. Joining both Dr. Prasad and I are Dr. Denghua Zhang, who's a research fellow at the Australian National University's Department of Pacific Affairs. Dr. Zhang has researched and studied extensively and written extensively on issues of Chinese aid, foreign policy, and development studies with increasing work on China and the Pacific Island states. A very warm welcome to both of you today.
Thank you.
Carnegie Endowment is a global think tank, and a lot of our audience is based all across the world, even though we're doing this for Carnegie China, regionally based. I thought I would start with asking both of you, maybe I can turn to you first, Dr. Zhang, on providing a broad overview of this relationship, the view from Beijing, the priorities from China toward the Pacific Island states, and how that fits in perhaps China's larger goals, perspectives, perceptions of its aid development goals, as well as foreign policy priorities.
Sure,
Dr.
thank
Zhang.
you. Before I start, I just want to thank the host for having me here. It's a great opportunity. And also thank you, Dr. Darshana, for moderating our event. And also, it's my great honor to join the discussion with Dr. Prasad. So thank you. So I just want to share with you a few points on the China-Pacific Islands relationship. The first is about the positioning of the Pacific Island countries in Chinese overall diplomacy. And to put it simple, Beijing or the Chinese government sees the Pacific region or Pacific Island countries as part of the Chinese, they call it extended neighborhood or the broader neighborhood. And also, I think it is fair to say the China-Pacific relationship from the perspective of the Chinese South-South cooperation. The Chinese government always sees the Pacific Island countries as the partners in the global South. So this is the point number one. The second is regarding the motivations for China to develop and strengthen their relationship with Pacific Island countries. I think there's always a mix of motivations for China, similar to Chinese relationship with the other countries in other regions. But in the Pacific region, one special thing is about the Taiwan issue or the One China issue. This is always the number one for the Chinese government. And if you follow this news on bilateral meetings, high-level meetings, we can see that the Taiwan issue or One China issue is always a must in their meeting agendas. And also, China needed the support from Pacific Island countries on other issues China considered as their core interest, such as Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, human rights. Yeah, so China has tried to seek support and voting support from these Pacific Island countries. And the second motivation to me that is important is it's more strategical. That is, Pacific Island countries has been seen, as I said, as part of the China's South-South cooperation to reduce pressure from Western powers alliance building. And I think this point has become more prominent since the COVID, and also in the context of growing geostrategic competition between China and the traditional powers or traditional development partners. Yeah, because China says that it is facing growing pressure from, let's say, Western powers. That's why China tries to seek more support from developing countries, such as from the Pacific Island countries. And other motives for China, like economic benefits or moral obligations, to me is less important compared with the previous two I mentioned. One is the Taiwan issue, the second is the strategic consideration. And the third point I want to mention is that the current geostrategic competition has prompted China to increase their engagement with Pacific Island countries in almost all sectors, whether foreign aid, development aid, or let's say the even security and military cooperation. And for example, I was just reading the news yesterday. I saw that there has been a first direct flight between Chinese Guangzhou and Port Moresby, the capital city in PNG, Papua New Guinea. So this is the first direct flight between these two countries. And it was started in December 2023 last year. So this is just one example of the latest development. And also China is continuing to do the big infrastructure projects, for example, in Fiji. And the current one they are planning to do, or they are starting to do, is called the Vanua level project, upgrade project. Yeah, this is a big one. They consider this project as they said the flagship project under the Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah, so these are just some examples China has been doing to promote engagement with Pacific Island countries. And it is also interesting that in recent years, we have seen a growing, let's say, security cooperation, including the policing cooperation between China and their partner countries in the region, such as Solomon Islands, such as Vanuatu, or even Kiribati. And another two things I want to mention regarding the growing engagement between China and Pacific Island countries, that I'm not sure whether you're aware that in recent years, the Chinese universities, they have established 7 major the Pacific research centers in China. 7 major Pacific research centers in China. Their role is to one of their main roles is to provide intellectual support to the Chinese government on policy making relating to the Pacific Islands. And also, one university, the name is called Beijing Foreign Studies University. They are also conducting a very ambitious teaching program. They are teaching the Pacific Island languages to students in China. It's quite interesting. Yeah, and the fourth major point I want to mention is that looking into the future, 6 new cooperation centers, which has already been established by China in recent years, will become the major platforms for China to promote cooperation with the island countries. For 6 new cooperation centers, they covering areas such as climate change, poverty reduction, or the disaster prevention and disaster reduction and preparedness, and also agriculture cooperation. And the last one is quite interesting. They call it the mushroom grass project. I'm not sure whether you have heard of some of them. Maybe you have already heard of this. This is the mushroom grass project. Just teaching the locals how to use the chopped mushroom grass to grow mushroom. And the last 2 points, I will keep this simple, is that we cannot simplify the relationship between Pacific Island countries and the region. I think the relationship between China and each of those partner countries in the region could be quite different. And also, the local perceptions about China can also be quite nuanced. So it's not just black and white, but quite nuanced. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great, and also for providing sort of metric on how China views the different aspects of its relationship with the Pacific Island states. Dr. Prasad, what's the view from the Pacific? How do the different nations view this relationship, the growing attention, the growing collaborations on many different sectors and pillars, and following also from Dr. Zhang's sort of opening remarks in terms of where, at least in his research, where he sees that the economic aspect might be lesser in terms of the geopolitical priorities that Beijing has. But then, what is the view from the Pacific, and how should the world be reading this?
Thank you, Darshana, and thank you very much for inviting me, and to Dr. Zhang, great to meet you, and thank you very much for your insightful opening remarks. Also, good morning and good evening to listeners across the Asia Pacific region. Let me, in response, Darshana, give a few framing remarks from the Pacific perspective. First of all, I would presume some of your audience might not be too familiar with the Pacific, so I really wanted to set, what is the Pacific, the size and scale of the Pacific. There's a sense that these are small island states somewhere in the distant corner of the planet. All of the Pacific put together, that's about 40 million square miles of the surface of the planet, probably a fifth, close to a fifth of the size of the planet as a whole. So this is the scale that you are talking about, and that's quite significant how large the Pacific is. Second, that in response to the geopolitical context of our time, US, China, and the contestation, etc., the Pacific, in very deliberate and measured ways, is reasserting what it is, and you will find that more and more of its leaders and scholars and others are using the term Blue Pacific. This is very, very deliberate on the Pacific's part. It is to say that do not take the Pacific for granted. We are a distinct set of nations with distinct identities, national identities, with distinct shared interests as a group of countries who share their sovereignty through their regional mechanisms such as Pacific Islands Forum, etc. It is very deliberate. It is very deliberate in response to terms such as Indo-Pacific, for example. It is very deliberate in response to terms such as extended neighborhood, that rather than others defining, yet again, long after the colonial period ended, what the Pacific is, this is Pacific defining itself. So it is quite deep, quite profound, and I'm not saying that lightly. China is the superpower of our times. There's absolutely no question about this. It is going to be the largest economy, and it is likely going to remain the largest economy for a long time. The two mighty economies of our era, US and China, interact across the Blue Pacific. This is the Blue Highway that connects these two, and any great power will have interest, therefore interest out of, first of all, stability on which its own prosperity rests, and second, that across such vast part of the planet that it allows access, and that access for maritime trade, for example, is something that they can all take for granted, or that they need to work on. And any large economy will have across the Blue Pacific, across any ocean, but largely in the Blue Pacific, some combination or the other of interest in some of these areas. It will have interest on the security on the seas, right? There's no question about that, and China does that. It will have interest on what is there in the waters, so fisheries and marine genetics, the things that will drive the next generation of medicine, etc., that will come from the waters. It will have interest on the seabed and the minerals and the rare earths, etc. So across the column, and any superpower will have interest in space, for which you will need monitoring and guiding, stations and observation stations across this part of the geography of the planet. So in all of these areas, China has, of course, deep interest across the Pacific. So does US, and the Pacific is saying that we will not want to be a spectator in this contestation. But as small states, in framing the Pacific, so where do small states of the Pacific as a collective group of nations look to protect and secure their interests? first and primary opening point is they look to international law and international treaties and international practice, right? These are not countries which will have nuclear missiles, which will have large navies, which will have large militaries. So they look to the international environment and what it provides to them in all of these areas. And I'm again saying this very deliberately, that small states look to the international system in ways that large countries like China and US will probably never understand. It is just so crucial to their survival. And so that's where they look. And one of the areas in which many countries are rightly concerned, in all of those areas where China has interest across the Pacific, as I've described, international law and practice is not so developed in so sophisticated ways. The International Treaty on High Seas has just been approved and only one or two countries have signed up to it. There's still contestation about law of the sea. And so many of these areas in which you look to international kind of jurisdiction and international law and practice that is very well understood is somewhat weak and evolving. And my last point I will make is that the profoundest sort of entry point for the Pacific in its relations with China and with everybody else is on climate change. And as you've heard me say before, and I will say it again, that the 1.5 degrees Celsius is not a guardrail for the Pacific. It is the finite boundary within which they think about lives and livelihoods and even state continuity. And China is which contributes something like more than a quarter of the greenhouse emissions and is likely to do so in the next decade or so, as US historically and others are very large players in this future determination. The strategic and the development engagement with the Pacific will begin and end with the climate story. Our story across most of the areas of life will be a climate story in the near term. And so they will look to China to both in the international system for solidarity and support to get the world back into this, and in terms of deep engagement, as Dr. Zhang is saying, in the development story, they will look to China for partnerships, for enduring partnerships in this story. This is their health story is a climate story, their education story is a climate story, their infrastructure story, their poverty story is a climate story. So I think this is the area in which the engagement and the strength of the engagement will have its sort of profoundest impact, I would think. And that's I know I don't speak on behalf of Pacific Island governments, etc., but you will rarely hear leaders not saying something very close to what I've just said.
Thank you so much, both. That was really great in terms of laying down some of the issues that I think that'll come to really be some of the cornerstones of the China-Pacific Island states relationship, but also how other powers and other actors and players in the Pacific or with partners in the larger region will be looking at it. There are a lot of interesting points that you both made that I want to take forward, but let me, continuing with Dr. Prasad's sort of emphasis on this whole geopolitics, the development story, everything starting and finishing with climate. Let me start with the conversation on climate, because and also in respect of how important this subject is to Pacific Island nations. Dr. Prasad, it was very interesting also, the certainty with which you acknowledged and accepted laid out that China is the superpower of our time, because there's still very much a discussion and debate in Washington and other places that China will be the superpower, and what does that going to mean for the world? And I think this perception and the perspective of how different parts of the world is managing, accepting, or engaging with this is really interesting and an important one to notice, because that's how policies are shaped. So let me pose this question to you first. What would you like to see the superpower of today do on climate change? What are the exact specific things, given it is also one of the largest contributor to exactly what he said in terms of emissions? What would you like to see in change in China's approach to climate change, and what would you like to see China do specifically on climate in the Pacific?
Okay, so thanks very much, and I did not mean to upset U.S. U.S. Listeners, but I think it's reasonably well understood that the center of the global economy has moved into Asia. This is likely to be in the next 30, 40 years, the top 3 out of 5 economies will be in this region: India, China, Indonesia, Vietnam, and others. And that's there are no short-term fixes to it. So if you just see that that the security and other interest will be kind of tied around that. So that's a starting point. Yeah. On the global climate story, both China and the US have by far the most important roles to play in our global climate story. There's very little Pacific, smaller states of the Pacific can do on their own. I mean, you can support them with their mitigation efforts, etc. It will make a tangential contribution to the global efforts. These two countries really need to do a lot more. US take a lot more of the responsibility for financing, etc. In China, a lot more. It is doing a lot. You know, it's such an impressive story, but a lot more and a lot faster, because, as I've said, 1.5 and reaching the 1.5 is going to be very consequential for the Pacific in 30, 40 years' time. That means if you breach it 1.5 in 2030, that means the low-lying atoll states, such as Tuvalu, cease to kind of be viable entities on land. They evolve. Their state forms may evolve in different ways, but this is how crucial it is, right? So that's the starting. They just need to collaborate. These two giants of our time need to collaborate in ways that we have not seen, far more intensely than to give us a fighting chance. And this can't be stop and start. This has to be consistent. This has to be over time and really meaningful. Second is that the climate story cuts across the Pacific. As I was saying, you know, many people may not understand what's climate got to do with health, or what's climate got to do with education. There's several countries in the Pacific who already spend each year of their education investment budgets. They spend more on repairing schools that are lost to cyclones, hurricanes, and floods than on building new schools and expanding. That transition point was reached already, perhaps a couple of decades back, and this can't continue. There are dozens, and there are probably hundreds of health centers at sea level that probably need to be moved to higher grounds within 10 years, not 20 years from now, to allow them to continue to function as health centers when storm surges take place. You know, very high tides come in, and when cyclones and floods take place. And so that's a big infrastructure story. The Pacific is losing more of its ports. These are oceanic states, right? So you need ports and ships to come in and out, and they're losing more of their ports to sustained strong winds and loss of land as a consequence of sea level rise. And that's hundreds and hundreds of infrastructure. So the far greater collaboration on the Pacific's infrastructure and the social development and the human development which is threatened by climate change right now, immediately, and which are likely to be threatened by climate change in future. I think that will define how and where and how fast China expands its cooperation. And in many of these areas, I've written before on these things, there are enormous opportunities, not only for China to work with the Pacific countries bilaterally, but for China to work with Pacific, its regional groupings, but also for China to be working with other development partners and in cooperative and collaborative ways, because the tasks are just so much. Tomorrow morning, I think across the Melanesia part of the Pacific, you probably need around 2,000 seawalls to be built. And that's beyond the financial capacity of any of these countries and all of them put together today. And that's just one small part of their climate story.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Zhang, if I could turn to you in terms of you've done a lot of work on development aid, Chinese development aid, and how that ties with sort of China's foreign policy. And Dr. Prasad just gave a very specific example in terms of, building seawalls as a response to climate change and effects in terms of infrastructure. What in your studies or in your view are some of the priorities in China's development aid? Is it because also in your opening remarks, you said that the development and the economic aspect might be slightly lower than, say, China's larger strategic or, diplomatic priorities that Beijing has. It's a conversation that comes up often. I'm right now sitting in Sri Lanka, and there's a lot of conversation about the development projects and loans and grants, and the country's come out of economic crisis. And it's not, right now, there's a lot that we have heard about Sri Lanka, but then there's also, it's not the only country. It's there are many other countries who are also jostling or managing this great power rivalry between a resident player, in the case of Sri Lanka, India and China, and in the Pacific, it'll be, say, China and US. So from your point of view, Chinese development aid, where does, what are the main strands of it, and how does will it answer the issues or the requests that, say, the region is asking for?
Sure, thank you for, I think this is a very good question. And just a few points. I think, first of all, apologies for coughing. This is a hay fever, not COVID, okay? First of all, the foreign aid has been used by Chinese government, to me, as the most important tool to support the Chinese diplomacy. So foreign aid has been used as a major tool by China. Second, in terms of the Chinese foreign aid spending, and for those of you who may not be familiar with the Chinese foreign aid in the Pacific, roughly 4% of the Chinese total aid spending, they go to the Pacific region. So the Pacific Islands, mainly those countries that recognize Beijing diplomatically, they received about 4% of the Chinese total aid budget. And that might sound small, but given the smaller population in the region, so the per capita could be good, quite high. And in terms of the major areas or priorities of the Chinese foreign aid program in the region, and it is no doubt infrastructure is always number one for the Chinese aid spending in the region. And this is an area the Chinese government is confident that they can do. They believe that based on their experience of the infrastructure development at home, they can share the experience of infrastructure development with the Pacific Island partner countries and also countries in other regions as well. So especially those big scale infrastructure projects like building airports, seaports, highways. And if you have a chance to visit some of the Pacific Island countries, you can easily see a lot of those, the big infrastructure funded by the Chinese government. And also, of course, those, let's say, the government buildings, such as the PM office, Prime Minister office, or the palace, and also those national sports stadium, such as the national sports stadium used by the Solomon Islands government to host the recent South Pacific Games. That's just a few weeks ago. And so infrastructure is the top priority, and this will continue to be so in the future. And in terms of, and of course, China is also providing aid in some other areas, such as agriculture. They have established the agricultural demonstration farms in many of the Pacific Island countries, such as in Tonga or in Samoa or in FSM, the Federated States of Micronesia. They're teaching the locals how for example, how to grow the mushroom grass, this type of thing. And also, health aid is another important area of the Chinese foreign aid. For example, they have been building some hospitals across the region in some Pacific Island countries. And the Chinese Chinese province, Guangdong province, they also regularly sent the short-term, the medical tours or the doctors to the Pacific region. And also for the Chinese PLA, the military, sometimes they will send the Peace Ark, the naval medical ships to the region. So the health aid is another sector. And in terms of the aid the composition, I think this is so important to mention, because as you mentioned, in total, Chinese foreign aid has 3 components. They have grants, they have interest-free loans, and they have the concessional loans, or some people will call soft loans. And because the proportion of loans is so high, especially the concessional loan is so high in Chinese foreign aid spending, and then I think some people believe that this leads to the issue of debts in some of the receiving countries, such as Sri Lanka, or such countries such as Tonga, because Tonga borrowed heavily from the China Export-Import Bank to rebuild the central business district in Tonga after the riot in 2006. So this is the loan-related debt issue. I think that the Pacific Island countries, those borrowing countries, they have to face in the future. So it's not an isolated case in the Pacific region, but it is a more general issue for all those countries that borrowed from Chinese Export-Import Bank. And I just want to add another point regarding the debt issue, regarding the Chinese concessional loans. There could be misperception that the borrowing country, they request the Chinese side to turn these concessional loans into interest-free loans and then into grants to write off the loans. But this is just a misperception. This is not true. So this means, I think, the concessional loan extension is more possible nowadays, unless Chinese government changes policy. So it is not possible to write off these concessional loans, but it is more possible to request the extension of payments. This is exactly what happened to Tonga. So they request a 2 5-year extension for the repayment of these loans. Yeah. And again, as I said, this is a more general issue for all the borrowing countries, not just in the Pacific region. And yeah, and I will stop here. Yeah.
No, thank you for sharing some of the details and nuances of the whole debt issue. It's a conversation across, I think, a lot of the smaller nations and islands as well. Dr. Prasad, I wanted to turn to you on this issue because there's also at least within foreign policy or geopolitical conversation, there's this idea or there's this notion that China is going with big amounts of cash and forcing its development projects on countries. But I think there's the other side to the story where a lot of the countries are choosing, despite concerns that bigger players might have about on sort of loans and grants or aid to build and address issues on the ground, which maybe traditional players have not been able to fill. I've heard you talk about issues of working with World Bank and IMF. I've heard you talk about sort of, there's a gap that China's in. I was wondering if you would share a little bit with the audience on the other side of the story from what the region, why are countries, despite these concerns about sustainable debt issues, are still choosing to work with China?
Thanks, Darshana. So this is a complex issue. First, let me just make a very general remark. Dr. Zhang, thanks for that detailing the different financing instruments and windows. So the climate story is a debt story. Okay, so if I throw one number back at you, Vanuatu lost 70% of its GDP in Cyclone Pam some years back. Subsequently, it lost another 12% of its remainder of the GDP by the subsequent cyclones that hit it. If I transpose that number onto China, China's current 18 trillion economy, that's like wiping off 12 trillion of the Chinese economy in the remainder of the 6. You have to pay the health workers, the doctors, make sure the aspirins are in hospitals, the roads are repaired, etc., with a third of the economy that is left. So that kind of sets the scale of what we are talking about. And this happens repeatedly in country after country, including Tonga, you have just described. So the Pacific is, we've heard recently, for example, Fiji's Deputy Prime Minister, Honorable Biman Prasad, speak at the Australian Aid Conference a few days before Christmas last year, where he articulated the Pacific Economic Ministers, Finance Ministers' views. One thing they're saying is that the response, the infrastructure that is lost to climate change, the infrastructure that needs to be repaired as a consequence of climate change, roads that get washed away, etc., that there should be a global agreement, and its bilateral partners should be part of this, where they are looking for investments in these areas to be of an ultra-concessional nature that take into regard what smallness means. These are small states with 1 or 2 drivers in the economy, 1 or 2 sectors of the economy from where they're generating resources. Those sectors themselves have been wiped away by the climate catastrophe that you are talking about, right? Then at the same time, in the catastrophe, you have to respond to 15, 16 very expensive infrastructure repair or infrastructure rebuild. So the thing with which you earn the revenues is wiped away, and the things with which you sustain an economy, roads, bridges, etc., they get wiped away as well. And that they don't have alternative drivers of the economy. And so in this context, they deserve in the international system space for small state specific financing windows. And I think I've heard more and more of their finance and economy ministers saying that none of the instruments work. Not the instruments that you describe in respect to China, certainly not the instruments that exist with the World Bank or ADB and this multilateral finance institution. So there's a drawing board request, and the sooner everyone, this is something that Pacific can only speak about, it can't influence. It doesn't have shareholding interest. It doesn't decide China or US's or Australia's development policy. It can only influence. It can talk about these things. So that's one starting point. And second is that in this region, if you can't be using the same ratios that, let's say, you have $10 to spend on development assistance in one country. Of this $10, $6 will be in loans, $4 will be highly concessional, and the remainder will be grants. That these ratios need to be small state specific, right? That you need to take into regard that a country such as Tuvalu with less than 20,000 people, it also needs a wharf, and the wharf in Tuvalu will cost no more than equal as building in a wharf in Fiji or in Australia, allowing 250, 500 ton ships to be able to land. The cost doesn't change because you are small, but your ability to service the concessional loan does change, right? And one concessional loan, as you have seen in the case of so many island countries, it puts your entire public finance out of whack. So this is a very unique challenge for the small island states. I hope that this year in the international system that there's some progress in redressing this hurt and this grievance that small states of the Pacific put. And I also really hope that China and Pacific's development partners will be on the side of the Pacific and not on the other side of the table, and with some amount of empathy and understand the predicament in which they now find themselves in.
So can I also
and
add,
so did I miss the second part of the question?
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
No, you're good, Dr. Prasad. Dr. Zhang, did you want to add something?
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Prasad. Can I add just a few very quick points regarding the in response to the question from the Darshana, why Pacific Island countries are still interested in applying for the Chinese financing or especially the Chinese loans? And as they are aware of the, let's say, some of those the debt risks, let's put it the most straightforward. And I think there are some advantages. From the supply side, from the Chinese side is they are very keen to provide the loans to the borrowing countries. And as I mentioned earlier, concessional loans are loans you need to repay in the future. Yeah, they are not grants. So this can reduce the financial burden on the Chinese government compared with grants, aid in grants. The second reason why the Chinese government is interested in providing loans is that a lot of these loans actually are offered to those Chinese contractors. So the Chinese state-owned enterprises, they will become the contractors. So of course, I think this will create, let's say, either the financial or the employment opportunities for the Chinese contractors, state-owned contractors. So this is some of the reasons from the supply side, from the Chinese side. From the demand side, that is the Pacific Island countries, one reason is that, as we mentioned earlier, there are huge gaps and demands in the Pacific Island countries, let's say, for infrastructure improvement. So there is a need there. Second is that if we compare the Chinese concessional loans with some of the other with the financing support from some, let's say, from the multilateral or some of the traditional development partners, maybe it is much easier. Maybe it is easier to apply for the Chinese loans because they may require less paperwork, and also they do not have the more rigid requirement on areas such as the good governance or the financial reform, or let's say human rights or democracy. I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying that this is just like a fact. So maybe some of the Pacific Island, the governments or officials, they like this type of thing, and also in terms of the bidding price, sometimes the Chinese contractors, Chinese companies, they can offer a lower price compared with their Western the competitors. But so this can help them to win the contract. But one of the things that after they got the contract, some of the companies may request the borrowing countries to top up. So I think this is another problem, and this problem actually has also been mentioned by the Chinese government themselves. It said this is bad. Yes, I will stop here. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think these are really sort of very nuanced aspects of the conversations on both sides of it, and this is a really important discussion to be had. But I think there are a lot of conversations, there are a lot of writings about these debt risks, also about why countries are working with China or XYZ. But I think Dr. Prasad, to your points also, when you say, it was really helpful to put into context the perspectives, the numbers or the sizes, and the process of it. And I think I've definitely heard you and your colleagues from around the region, but not just from the Pacific, from the Indian Ocean side, which is the other ocean that I work on, about that, the existing mechanisms, whether it's World Bank or ADB, are not necessarily suited to actually address the concerns of smaller states who are also at the forefront of climate change, but doesn't necessarily have the ability to affect change in a way that larger countries do. But then the larger countries don't face the same amount of challenges that smaller nations do in terms of climate. So I think it's a broader question, but these nuances definitely help put that into perspective. So thank you for that. Just a note to our audience watching in, listening in, if you have questions, please put them in the comment or the chat box on YouTube, and we'll get to them shortly. I wanted to move a little bit toward the geopolitical and the strategic aspect of this relationship and the conversation. And I think the one thing that's been, of course, on everyone's mind recently is the diplomatic switching of Taiwan to sort of the one China policy, because we've seen that happen with Nauru, and there are conversations about other Pacific islands who might adopt a similar approach or a policy, whether it's Tuvalu, and that it has happened in the past with other countries. Dr. Zhang mentioned at the beginning that there's a lot of that there's a string attached to a lot of the projects, that it's a recognition of China's one China policy. It's a recognition of or not recognize or addressing or seeking support on some of the domestic sensitive issues. Dr. Prasad, your views on that in terms of the importance of this, the switching of diplomatic recognition in the Pacific, and how do you see this going forward? How does that shape? And is there a concern in the Pacific on this aspect?
On the switching, look, I don't make any big deal. I'm always pleasantly surprised Pacific gets a mention in world press because we never tend to do when there's a switching that takes place. So that's, negative way, probably positive thing. At least the world thinks about the Pacific and that they exist and they have some concerns, etc. Governments will come in and governments will go, and these decisions will be taken, and that's where things are. I'm not too have any views about what Nauru should choose or not choose. It's for Nauruans and for their elected governments, right? Second is that on the security thing, I think often it is this discussion is tied to somehow the security. And let me say again, there's a very significant nuance in the Pacific about security questions. The Pacific, by very nature, for all the reasons I've described and for 100 other reasons, they like to think about their security issues in their regional constellations, in their regional decision-making processes. And the primary of that is the Pacific Island Forum, where all of them get together. And this is not only the sovereign independent countries, but also the states that are colonies, New Caledonia and French Polynesia. They are also part of this. So this is where some of the big decisions, etc., take place, and that's very important. It's a survival mechanism for the Pacific in a geopolitical contestation. That's number one. And they know these are large countries, China, US, they have large interests, etc. And being together is the way in which they can best protect and preserve their interests. That's number one. And second, that maybe many of your listeners don't know. I mean, all of the countries have some type of navy, couple of naval boats. At the best, only two of them have militaries, Fiji and Papua New Guinea. And even when I use the term naval, please take that in a guarded way. Kiribati, pronounced Kiribati, is a country of that spans about 4 million square kilometers of the Pacific. It has one naval boat, right? And so the idea that it can protect its own waters with one naval and fisheries, it's its main resource. So they have to think about how to do fisheries management, for example, as a regional group, how to do security on the high seas as a regional group. And Australia and New Zealand are very much part of this formation and through the Pacific Island Forum. So there's this notion of shared sovereignty, of deep cooperation and collaboration between the small island states of the Pacific and Australia and New Zealand as being part of that is very significant. So when countries that are from outside of the region think and about their security engagement in the region, Pacific Island Forum grouping, which includes Australia and New Zealand, sit and think about its implication, as they must. And so that's an important security consideration. And I know China has extremely close relations with Australia and New Zealand, and many of the security issues are shared. But I wanted to mention 3 or 4 issues on security in a different way, not in the hard security, the way I think you are framing. But because these are small states, and because I've given you one sense of their limited capabilities, they look to their partners that if China is a genuine friend of the Pacific, if US is a genuine friend of the Pacific, if Japan is a genuine friend of the Pacific, that some of the problems that come with their engagement are sorted by them, because we simply will not have the capacity. We will not have the capacity to deal with cybercrime, for example. We expect that these countries will do their share and a disproportionate and something about their share that impacts on our countries to deal with these type of issues. With the narcotics and criminal gangs operating on the high seas, I've given you a sense of the scale, right? That these countries will take any interest in helping us resolve some of the narcotics issues, and on illegal fisheries, which is a very important resource for the Pacific. For many countries, their whole GDP is based on fisheries alone. And if we are already losing fisheries as a consequence of warming waters, tuna is migrating into cooler waters, so that's a loss. And then if on top of that, you continue to lose fisheries because of illegal fisheries, underreported fisheries, then, the net loss is much more. So the Pacific Island states look to countries like China and US and others to do their share on in ensuring at least that the fleets that are registered on which they have control, that they will be doing a disproportionate amount of that in the Pacific. And they look to these, their partnerships will look and feel better if they're doing their fair share. And probably there's a perception that they're not doing their fair share. I hope this perception change based on evidence, etc. But these are small states and with so limited resources that it's so unfair to expect them to be continuing to make an outsized contribution to resolving some of these issues that are tied to kind of national expansion of national businesses and so on. It will be such a strain. And one of my last points I will make, Darshana and Dr. Zhang, is the stress on that the global geopolitical contestation, China, US, and all of these put together are stress points on some of the regional architecture that we have. These are already dealing with so many issues and challenges, some of which we have discussed. And on top of that, if geopolitical relations and contestation is put on, they add to the stress. And I hope that we reach accommodation and understanding in the Pacific as a zone of peace, as a zone of cooperation, as a zone of collaboration, so that some of the stresses that are put by this contestation on our regional institutions, on our architecture, on our fragile kind of collaborative mechanisms are reduced to give the Pacific the fighting chance. And I hope and I know that China will do the right thing in this, and I really hope that we will see a lot more action in this area as well.
Thank you, Dr. Prasad. Those are some really important points, and especially for framing security itself, because everybody defines security very differently: hard security versus soft security, traditional versus non-traditional. So really putting front, up, and center what security means for the Pacific and how Pacific Islands view that. I had one question. There are a few questions coming in from our audience, but a few times during this conversation, you have, of course, talked about the importance of the ocean and ocean security, and within the umbrella of security, protection of high seas, etc. Every nation has a very different reputation in different domains and in different theaters. For instance, the US might have a different perception, and the Pacific are different in the Indian Ocean and different in the Atlantic, etc. So in terms of China's own track records or sort of engagements on maritime security issues, on issues of sort of engaging in the maritime domain, it has a very different perception in the South China Sea because of its sovereignty issues, because of, say, not really abiding by international law, not really abiding by international treaties, courts, jurisdictions, etc., but also having different perceptions on UNCLOS. And that perception changes when China comes up to, say, the Indian Ocean, where it does not have a sovereignty issue, or when it goes to the Pacific. I want to ask you in terms of if there are concerns in the Pacific about different interpretations of laws and treaties, which many countries apply and invoke. But also, as you rightly pointed out, from deep sea mining to fishing, etc. Again, China is one of the key players that is identified as an actor in illegal fishing, right? Because in all issues of maritime militia, etc. So are there concerns in terms of watching how bigger players are behaving or extending or engaging on the issues that they uphold in international, that they want others to uphold, but maybe are breaking it themselves because smaller nations don't have the exact power or the capacity to implement those? Are there concerns on this, given, again, maritime domain is the key domain for Pacific Island nations?
Dr. Zhang?
Dr. Prasad, Dr. Zhang, either.
I do not have an answer to this question, I think. But I think a general point is that the Chinese side, they have been trying to, the South China Sea issue has been built by China, has, as an issue related to Chinese core interest. I think especially under the current President Xi Jinping. And I think at international the arena, the Chinese side, the Chinese government, they are trying to seeking support from the Pacific Island countries on the Chinese position on the South China Sea issue. Yeah, I think if I'm right, I think some of the island countries, they have offered some type of this type of the diplomatic or the vocal support to China on Chinese position. Yeah. Other than that, I do not have anything to add. Yeah, I'll stop here. Yeah.
Dr. Prasad, if you have.
So, Darshana, I've made, and thanks, Dr. Zhang, for those responses. Very, very helpful to me to also think about my own response. I think one thing for the Pacific, something I'm sorry I'm repeating, is that the Pacific pays such a outsized emphasis on international law and international practice, right? So that's one thing. And anytime it's any of its partners is seen to be departing too much from any international practice or law, is interpreted not in a positive way, and that's very mild. It's interpreted in a negative way, that because for Pacific, international law and practice is the Bible. They don't have diplomatic influence and networks and other things. So that's my first remark. And second is that they think about that, if international law is not adhered to, how else will they be protecting their interest across their own waters, in their sovereign waters, over which they have limited kind of naval and satellite and other capabilities to manage activities, and in the outer exclusive economic zones, and in the waters that are outside, but that are within 2 or 3 Pacific Island countries that are on the high seas, effectively. So they're deeply concerned about this, and they keep on reminding, and you will find your Chinese diplomats and others there are many engagements with Pacific diplomats and Pacific leaders. International law will keep on coming up. And I will take this opportunity, I think this is my last entry, also to quickly comment on the two questions in the chat box. One on the BRI, Pacific perceptions. I think the Pacific's perceptions are about their now 2050 strategy. They've taken lot of time to come up with a 2050 strategy, which many leaders have used the term North Star. This is the way in which they want to engage with the world. So they've taken time, they've given a response, and I hope the response is not about large-scale infrastructure, but let 1,000 flowers bloom, small, beautiful projects, as Arabella has said in the comments. And on the initiatives on civilization, security, development, Pacific really welcome, thinking about and preserving cultures and civilization, because their cultures and are threatened in ways like no other. And many people might not understand the depth and breadth of diversity across the Pacific. In Papua New Guinea alone, with 10 million plus people, there's something like 825 languages, something just less than 20% of the world's language exist in this one small Pacific island country alone, and multiplied across the Pacific. So they really think about what is at stake when some of these communities are no longer viable, or some of these communities are severely threatened by developments. And it's very important in this seek great collegiality with China and its other partners in helping preserve its cultures and vast diversity of traditions across this region.
So
thank you.
Can I have a quick point?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say that we are almost in time, but then please feel to offer your concluding remarks and address any of the questions.
I think just some quick responses to these two questions as well. I think for the first question, I think for these three new global initiatives under the let's say under the name of Xi Jinping, has now become a new focus of the Chinese the foreign policy, or new focus of the Chinese diplomacy. So that means the Chinese diplomats, they have been working hard to promote these new initiatives, like they did with the BRI. And to some extent, I think these new initiatives, especially those global development initiatives, to some extent they overlap with much of the BRI, because of BRI they also cover lots of the areas for 4 or 5 sectors. So to some extent they're quite similar. And to the second, some response to the second question regarding the shift of the Chinese BRI, and also I think the Chinese foreign aid, the program. I think yes. I think to some extent, yes, the Chinese side, they have been shifting from those large-scale infrastructure projects and to those they call the small but beautiful the projects. And one example, I think one reason why do this shift is related to those, let's say, to some reasons. One is related to the debt concern about debts related to Chinese loans. The second is that I think Chinese side hope that by doing those type of the small and beautiful projects, that they can have they can improve the perceptions of those let's say the general public in the Pacific region. Let's say such as at the grassroots level, people, for example, those people who can benefit from small projects like the mushroom grass project. This is really good example. Yeah, I was teaching class last November or December, and one student, she is a leader of the NGO in Papua New Guinea, and she mentioned this. She said she herself has benefited from those the mushroom grass the project. Yeah, so I think the Chinese side hope that by doing this type of small but beautiful projects, they can improve the image of the China aid in the region, but of course I think some of the concerns about the BRI and also about the Chinese loans more broadly, such as the debt risks, or the lack of transparency, or the lack of, let's say the insufficient job opportunities for the locals, I think will not easily go away. Yeah, let me stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Zhang and Dr. Prasad. We're slightly over time, but with a topic and a subject which as vast as this, it does get really interesting. Thank you both very much for joining us today and helping us navigate some really complex conversations, but also my sincere gratitude to both of you for bringing in really important nuances of this conversation within the short one period, whether from debt risk to development aid to geopolitics and security and international law. I think we've covered quite a bit, and Carnegie on our end will be sharing the video and promoting it so that others can hear your views, perceptions. But thank you so much for doing this, for providing the two perspectives on China and the Pacific Island nations. And thank you to all of you who joined us and sent us questions. We'll look forward to seeing you at the next Global Dialogue Series. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr.